Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News. First off, a friendly reminder that your entries for a chance to win one of 3 Blu-ray copies of The Age of Adeline from our friends at Dolby Atmos are due by the end of the day on Sunday. I already have a bunch of great entries from you guys already, but again, you still have time to come up with your tweet. And you have to tweet me at Grace Randolph and include the hashtag Dolby Atmos, and then with the rest of your tweet, tell me what you would do if you were immortal, because The Age of Adeline tells the story of Blake Lively, who through a freak accident finds herself in the exact same situation. All right, so let's move on to today's morning movie news. We've got the usual 3 stories and a viewer question because that was just a reminder. Now, a story that trended, or a movie that trended for most of the day yesterday was Roadhouse, as people on the internets were divided as to whether or not it was a good idea if Ronda Rousey were to remake this classic cult hit from 1989 starring the one, the only, Patrick Swayze. It's interesting because we were just talking about gender-flipping roles the other day with the new Sandra Bullock movie, Our Brand is Crisis, and then lo and behold, Ronda Rousey is doing that with Roadhouse. So even if you don't think it's a good idea, though, it seems to be happening. They're moving forward with this very aggressively. I believe it's an MGM movie, and MGM's trying very hard to, remake their slate and not have to rely entirely on James Bond. But Ronda Rousey's been in the news quite a bit lately. We've discussed her for Captain Marvel, a role she has personally lobbied for, and she just seems to be really making some strides. She's going to make a bio about herself where she's going to star playing, Ronda Rousey, and she's been in the news for continuing to dominate in her originating field, and that's wrestling. She's kind of overtaken Gina Carano. Gina Carano had her own shot at being a movie star. Steven Soderbergh made her the star of Haywire, where the selling point was, the fights are real. And while the fights were impressive, I'm sorry to say the rest of the movie was not, even though they had her going up against people like Channing Tatum and Michael Fassbender and Antonio Banderas. So she certainly wasn't lacking for a supporting cast. And I'm sure they'll surround Ronda Rousey with very talented people here as well. Now, one of the interesting things about Ronda Rousey, I'm going to do a whole big thing on her next week, but I wanted to discuss this story today while it's hot. And that's that she's just signed with a new agency. She has representation in Hollywood, and they feel if Dwayne Johnson can have not only a career, but a great career, especially coming off of San Andreas, why can't Ronda Rousey? She's going to be the female Dwayne Johnson. But, what I would say to that, though, is that Dwayne Johnson and his predecessor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, were pretty darn good right off the bat. I mean, sure, they never became like Shakespearean-level actors or anything like that, but they were very good at being natural and believable on the silver screen. And, Schwarzenegger, I think he might have loosened up a tad, but, I think that he was well used. They found the right talent. For instance, both James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger benefited from that partnership. And so often, actors and directors will team up and both parties will benefit from the collaboration. Not just when it's with a wrestler or somebody like that, obviously. Scorsese, DiCaprio, Tim Burton, Johnny Depp, etc., etc. But the thing is that I'm trying to say here is that Schwarzenegger and Johnson seem like naturals to cross over to acting. Whereas Ronda Rousey, while I'm rooting for her, and if she can, all she has to do basically is act, and I haven't seen that yet. She seemed very stilted in the work that she's done so far. Game, but stilted. And I've seen her in The Expendables 3, the latest Fast and Furious film, Furious 7, and then, of course, Entourage. And again, in all 3 of those movies, she was certainly, trying very hard to do a good job, but she was leagues behind where Schwarzenegger and Johnson started. So while I'm rooting for Rousey as a fan and as a moviegoer, from a businessman's perspective, I just don't know if she could make it. And I would be very wary to invest any money in her. So I'm glad that they're going to do this with Roadhouse. She said she got the blessing from Patrick Swayze's widow to remake the movie, which I think was a nice touch. But I think for anyone else to sign her on, I would wait and see how this movie performed, or at least what the buzz for it was. As you know, it's good business to get your next movie deal signed before your next movie gets released, just to play it safe. Sometimes you undercut yourself if it's bigger than expected and you could have gotten more money, but then, it's a real roll of the dice because if it underperforms, your deal could just fall through entirely. And you'll have no deal. Forget, extra money. But I'm curious, what do you think of Ronda Rousey as a movie star? As this becomes less of a fun idea and an actual, possibility, are you excited for it? And do you think that Ronda Rousey can be the female Dwayne Johnson? And also, what do you think of remaking Roadhouse? Is that sacrilegious to you? Or are you like, oh, I like it, with the gender flip, it's a good idea. Also, on a side note, I watched the trailer again. I've seen Roadhouse, but a long time ago. Of course, it's a cult classic film. It's the kind of film that you stumble across or someone recommends to you. But I don't remember it very well. And I watched the trailer, and a big, running gag was everyone was going to Patrick Swayze and going, oh, you're a lot smaller than I thought you'd be, for someone who's supposed to be a bouncer at this really tough bar. And I think that would play very well with Ronda Rousey. You're a lot smaller than I thought you'd be. Or, you're a woman. I think they could go with that. But I think Ronda Rousey's a little too smart to play the female card that prominently. I think she'd be, a lot more savvy, and it would benefit her to just do a straight remake and not address the gender flipping. All right, so that's the first story of the day. Now, talking about strong female characters, here's a blast from the past. Speaking of Roadhouse, here's another one, Bridget Jones. And they are, yes, making a third Bridget Jones movie. And it's actually going to star Renee Zellweger, which is fascinating because Bridget Jones, Renee Zellweger, as a lot of male stars do, she really, fluctuated her weight for that role to play it. It was a big part of the Bridget Jones character is based on how she feels about her appearance. And of course, Renee Zellweger has been in the news lately for altering her own significantly through plastic surgery. And there was debate as to whether or not that was anyone's business, what she decided to do with herself, etc., etc. But here's where it becomes everybody's business, or at least Hollywood's business, and that's whether or not by altering herself with cosmetic surgery, will she lose her audience? Will she still be able to also play Bridget Jones? I'm glad they're having her come back instead of recast the role, but still, I think this could be a real question mark with that film. Now, it's called Bridget Jones Baby, and sadly, Bridget is still single, but now she has a baby. So she's struggling with single parenthood, Mr. Darcy is still in her life. Let's see here, I had the thing up here. Mark Darcy, of course, playing off of Colin Firth's famous breakthrough role in Pride and Prejudice on the BBC. That's what made him famous, and so that's kind of like a nod to that. So Colin Firth, interestingly, after Kingsman, will be returning to this franchise. So either he really believes in it, or they've offered him a lot of money. But it really is kind of a return in sorts because the original director is also coming back, Sharon Maguire, who really hasn't done much else since the first Bridget Jones. But let's see if she can recapture the magic. Although the one person who isn't coming back is Hugh Grant. Although I find that odd because what is Hugh Grant doing, right? Besides having cameos and flops like the Man from U.N.C.L.E. But they've replaced him, or they've brought in someone else to play the role as a mystery, and that's Patrick Dempsey, who, of course, is off of Grey's Anatomy, having decided to leave that show. So I don't know if Patrick Dempsey helps this movie or hurts it. He's been in a couple of romantic comedies, but they've all been like real, like, the kind of thing that you discover on Netflix and the like, and not as a cult hit like Roadhouse. Like, seriously, like the kind of movie you watch on a plane. Like, I think like he made a romantic comedy with Michelle Monaghan, etc., etc. If you get your hair blown out at like Dry Bar, etc., and they play movies, Patrick Dempsey movies are the perfect movie to play in there. That's basically how I would describe his films. But maybe that's just what this needs. Maybe that's just what Bridget Jones needs, and they're very cleverly playing into their audience. But at the same time, you don't want to make it seem too much like a TV movie. Also, Helen Fielding is returning, and word is that this isn't based on one of her books, but actually a series of columns that she's written lately. So we'll see if they can bring back Bridget Jones. And it was never a strong box office performer domestically here in the U.S., never even got to $100 million. I think about $70 million for the first one and about $40 for the second. But overseas, this thing was a juggernaut, making over $200 million with both films, and of course, they're not particularly big budget. So I can see them wanting to return to it. Why not? I mean, if you were a studio executive and this came across your desk, considering how low the budget was, why not remake it, right? I mean, I think that definitely is very likely to turn a profit, if not a substantial profit. So that's the second story of the day. I'm curious to what you think of that. Would you see Bridget Jones's Baby? And what do you think of Renee Zellweger? Can she, pick up where she left off, at least with this franchise, even though she's changed herself so drastically physically, and not through the matter of just, weight loss and, living a healthy life, but by going under the knife. And then also Patrick Dempsey, do you think that he's a good addition? And also, how about Colin Firth? His career is, many could argue, I would argue, at an all-time high. And then here he is returning to this. Is it too much of a step back, or do you think it shows that he's a good sport? Now, for the third story of the day, Austin DL, a BTT viewer, said, Grace, you've got to talk about this Legend poster that came out, because everybody's talking about the fact that they've hidden a bad review on it, and it's quite cheeky. So I think this is interesting. Now, as you can see, here's the poster here, and you can see there's 2 stars between the 2 Tom Hardy heads. He's playing twins here in this movie, Parent Trap style. And it says The Guardian, and it looks like they're hiding 4 stars, because everything else is 4 stars. But what everybody pointed out when this poster debuted is that in reality, The Guardian gave the movie 2 stars. So they've decided to hide it and make it look like 4 stars, which I think is interesting, because if you have all those other 4-star reviews, why call attention to the 2-star review? I mean, that's all everybody's talking about, that The Guardian gave the movie 2 stars. I guess maybe they wanted to kind of like take The Guardian head on and be like, you guys are party poopers, everybody else loves this movie, so you suck. But you know who else didn't love that movie? The Hollywood Reporter. Over the weekend, a ton of movies hit the festival circuit, as we discussed on Movie Math, and Hollywood Reporter published a slew of reviews. So I was curious what the buzz was for these films right out of the gate. And lo and behold, they also did not like Legend and said that it was a very flashy, showy production that was fun to watch, like to look at, but in terms of having any substance or a good story, not happening. So if I were a Legend, I wouldn't get too ahead of myself, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have to hide a couple of more other reviews on their posters in the future. But it's an interesting way to go with advertising, and I'm curious, what do you think? If you were the PR people for Legend, would you go with this? Or do you think, why call attention to that negative review, as I said? And also, what do you think is going to happen to Legend? It's going up against The Martian at the box office here in the United States. Also, I believe Legend is playing in the UK, so if you've seen Legend in the UK, please let us know, is it any good? But it's opening opposite Matt Damon in The Martian, which is supposed to be a juggernaut, a huge performer, like a blockbuster. Like, it might just follow in the footsteps of Gravity after all, and they, of course, took Gravity's release date, and hoping to follow in the footsteps of Gravity. So we'll see. All right, so those are the 3 stories of the day, and I have a very interesting question from another BTT viewer, JC Epic, otherwise known as Joe C. So Joe says, hello, Grace. I have finally got a question available for you. So this is it. I was watching Assault on Arkham for the 2nd time, and when watching it, I only started to realize, for the 2nd time, the amount of innocent people that died during the film. This began to make me dislike the movie partially, and I was wondering whether this could affect the live-action movie and the audience response, seeing as in Man of Steel, people were quick to complain about the amount of deaths there. Would it make it hard for the audience to root for these villains? That's my question. Sorry, I hope you get the time to answer this. Great question, Joe. No need to apologize. I'm so glad that you took your time, but that you did eventually come up with a question and that you put it up there, and I'm so glad, and I'm honored to have chosen it. And it's a very interesting question. I'm curious to see what everyone else is going to say. Now, there's a fine line between realistically showing, there's like the fine line when you walk it is you realistically show a difficult situation. Now, on both sides of that fine line are an irresponsible depiction of loss of life, and then also an unrealistic one. Like, for instance, in cartoons, people always fall like into the water or onto a canopy, and they just conveniently don't die, right? I believe Batman the Animated Series was famous for that, or infamous, depending on what you like to see in your animation. But anyway, obviously, you don't want a situation in Suicide Squad where no one dies, because again, as I said when I talked about my recent video of playing the odds for which Suicide Squad characters are going to die in the movie first, you can't have a movie called Suicide Squad and everyone's okay. So there's going to be collateral damage. And the reason with Man of Steel was a problem was because, first of all, it's Superman, and Superman is supposed to care about stuff like that, right? And then also, there was just such wanton disregard for life, right? Like, people said, well, you know, why didn't Superman try and take the fight away from the city, as he does so often in the comics? It was just basically sloppy writing on the part of the Man of Steel screenwriters. They created a situation where you could question Superman's actions. Now, I think there's no problem with having loss of life in a Superman story, but I think you have to be very careful how you approach it to make sure that you don't hurt the character by his response or his actions. So that was the problem with Man of Steel. And also Narnia, the second Narnia. I got really upset with that franchise because I basically felt these little British school children went to a magical world, led an army of mystical creatures, got a bunch of them killed as horrible commanders, and then were like, oops, and then went back to London. And I was like, you massacred those people and they believed in you. You know, it's one of the reasons, like, for instance, in Vietnam, people started assassinating their platoon leaders, their commanders, because they were leading them on suicide missions. And they were like, well, we're not going to die, but we can't go against you because you're our commanding officer, so they would just kill them. So that's obviously a very dark story. But, you know, that just goes to show the danger poor leadership can put a group of people in. And people sometimes take actions. And when they don't, they all needlessly die. So anyway, for Suicide Squad, I think the way they should handle this, in my opinion, is that they should have these characters understanding that this is a difficult job and anyone who signed up for it has to understand that they could die, including anyone who is a red shirt, you know, or like a super red shirt, like not even a red shirt on the Suicide Squad, but one of those nameless soldiers who are following them around, right? So I think the Suicide Squad, as long as they don't take any joy in those deaths, I guess unless you're the Joker, but even that's a fine line. And also, you don't get to the situation where the audience feels they would let you die, right? That's really important, how the audience relates to the character they're seeing on screen. If it's a situation like, oh, well, that nameless dude died, oh, that raises the stakes for us, fine. But if the Suicide Squad is turning on each other, and also maybe turning on the audience, or people who who don't necessarily have to die, like innocents, I think that could maybe cross a line, especially if people feel it's inspiring real-life violence. And especially considering some of the, you know, bad situations we have going on today with people in public places, in the United States in particular, but also even in other places. Those horrible IKEA murderers from last month, where someone decapitated a mother and her adult son in IKEA, in the middle of an IKEA aisle. So I think people are very sensitive to that, and they don't want to see entertainment seeming to encourage that type of behavior. So I think that it's definitely a fine line that Suicide Squad has to walk, but I think that if they do it responsibly and carefully, they can get away with some collateral damage in the movie, and they have to, or else people aren't going to take the movie Suicide Squad seriously. But it's not an enviable task, and I think in the past David Ayer he's done a mixed bag in terms of how he handles deaths. Quentin Tarantino would have been fantastic, but unfortunately he didn't get the gig. It went to David Ayer, so we'll see how he does with it. I think that what I'd like to end on with that viewer question and my answer to it is that Daredevil recently on Netflix was a great example of a show that had a lot of collateral damage, even sometimes at the hand of Daredevil. For instance, there's a sequence in an alleyway with an individual who's also blind in the back of a taxi, and you know, Daredevil does nothing to try and save him, and that was a little bit sketchy. But I think in the context of the show and the rules of the world they set up, it worked. So we'll see if they can pull that off with Suicide Squad. But I think Daredevil is a great, you know, place to look for inspiration on how to walk such a fine line. All right, that's today's morning movie news. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please write down below what you think of today's top 3 stories and that viewer question. Anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.